For most of my life, I explained myself constantly. I explained my decisions to my children. I explained my choices to my doctor. I explained my spending to my siblings. I explained my opinions to friends, my lifestyle to neighbors, even my simple daily preferences to people who had no real stake in my life at all. I believed, without ever questioning it, that being a reasonable, considerate person meant offering justification for nearly everything I did. At 70, I stopped. And my dear friends, I want to tell you honestly, this single change transformed how I move through the world more than almost anything else I have done in my later years. Today I want to walk you through why I finally stopped explaining myself after 7 decades of doing exactly that, what this shift actually looks like in daily practice, and why I believe so many of us, particularly as we grow older, would benefit enormously from doing the same. A lifetime of justifying myself, I want to paint an honest picture of what my life looked like before this change, because I suspect many of you will recognize pieces of yourselves in this description. If I decided to spend money on something for myself, a new coat, a trip, a piece of furniture I simply liked, I would find myself explaining the reasoning to my children or my siblings before they even asked, as though I needed to justify the purchase preemptively to avoid any potential judgment. If I declined an invitation to a social gathering because I was tired or simply preferred a quiet evening, I would offer an elaborate excuse rather than a simple, honest answer. When my health began requiring more careful attention in my 60s, I found myself explaining every doctor's recommendation, every medication, every lifestyle adjustment to my adult children in exhaustive detail, as though I owed them a complete accounting of every decision regarding my own body. When I decided, several years ago, to sell a piece of property that had been in the family for decades, I spent weeks preparing detailed explanations for extended family members, anticipating their questions and objections before they had even been raised, exhausting myself in advance over conversations that, in many cases, never actually occurred. I want to be honest about why I lived this way for so long. I believed, deep down, that my choices required outside validation in order to be legitimate. I believed that offering thorough explanations would prevent conflict, prevent judgment, prevent the discomfort of anyone disagreeing with decisions I had every right to make on my own. I believed, essentially, that my life needed to be justified to the people around me before it could be considered acceptable to actually live it. What this pattern was actually costing me, I did not fully understand the cost of this constant explaining until I found myself, at 69 years old, utterly exhausted after a family gathering during which I had spent nearly the entire afternoon justifying a decision about my own retirement savings to relatives who, upon reflection, had no genuine stake in that decision at all. Driving home that evening, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical activity and everything to do with the emotional labor of constant justification I had been performing for decades. I began to notice, once I started paying attention, just how much of my daily mental and emotional energy was consumed by anticipating objections, preparing justifications, and managing other people's potential reactions to choices that were, in the end, entirely mine to make. This constant anticipatory explaining was not simply tiring in the moment. It was quietly teaching everyone around me something I never intended to communicate, that my decisions required their approval before I could feel settled in making them. I also began to notice something troubling about how this pattern affected the way people treated me. The more I explained myself, the more people seemed to feel entitled to question, challenge, or offer counterarguments to my decisions. It was as though my own extensive justifications were quietly signaling that the matter remained open for debate, an invitation for further discussion rather than a settled decision I had already made with full confidence. The moment I finally understood the specific moment that finally crystallized this realization for me involved my decision to move to a smaller home following my 70th birthday. I had spent, true to my old pattern, considerable time preparing detailed explanations for my children about why I wanted to downsize, anticipating every possible objection about safety, about proximity to family, about my emotional attachment to the family home. When I finally shared my decision, I delivered nearly 15 minutes of careful justification before anyone had even asked me a single question. My daughter, listening patiently to this extensive explanation, eventually said something to me that I have carried with me ever since. She said, gently, "Dad, you don't need to convince us. It's your house. It's your decision." I remember sitting with this comment for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me. She was right. I did not actually need her approval to make this decision. I had been offering an elaborate justification for a choice that was entirely mine to make, and in doing so, I had been quietly communicating that I myself was not fully confident it was mine to make without external validation. This moment became the beginning of a genuine transformation in how I approach decisions and conversations for the remainder of my life. Why explaining yourself doesn't actually earn respect. I want to share with you something important I came to understand through this experience, because I believe it explains why this shift produces such significant results. Constant explanation, offered from anxiety rather than genuine desire to share information, does not actually earn the respect and understanding we hope it will produce. In fact, I believe it often produces the opposite effect. When you offer extensive justification for a decision, you are quietly communicating uncertainty about your own right to make that decision without outside approval. This uncertainty, communicated through excessive explanation, tends to invite further questioning rather than settling the matter, because it suggests, even unintentionally, that the decision remains open for genuine debate rather than being a settled matter you have already confidently determined. By contrast, a brief, calm, confident statement of your decision, offered without extensive justification, communicates something entirely different: genuine ownership of your own life and choices. People, I have discovered consistently, tend to respect confidence far more than they respect elaborate justification. A person who states their decision simply and moves forward without anxious over-explanation is generally treated with more respect and less pushback than a person who offers extensive justification, however reasonable that justification might genuinely be. What's stopping actually looks like I want to be clear about what this practice involves, because I do not want you to misunderstand it as becoming curt, dismissive, or unwilling to share genuine information with people you love. Stopping the habit of excessive explanation does not mean refusing to communicate at all. It means offering brief, honest statements rather than extensive justifications, and it means resisting the urge to preemptively defend decisions before anyone has even questioned them. When my children ask me a genuine question about a decision I have made, I answer honestly and directly, without unnecessary elaboration. If my daughter asks why I decided to sell the family property, I might simply say, "It felt like the right time, and I'm at peace with it," rather than the 15-minute justification I once would have prepared. If someone questions my decision further, I do not necessarily refuse further conversation, but I no longer feel compelled to defend my position exhaustively, repeating and expanding my justification until the other person finally agrees or relents. I also stopped offering preemptive explanations for decisions that no one had actually questioned. In the past, if I made a purchase for myself, I would explain my reasoning to family members before anyone had even asked about it, anticipating judgment that, in most cases, was never actually forthcoming. Now, I simply make my decisions and live them, without offering unsolicited justification to preempt objections that may never actually materialize. Applying this to decisions about my own life and body, one of the most significant areas where I applied this shift involved decisions about my own health and body as I have aged. For years, I felt compelled to explain every medical decision to my adult children in exhaustive detail, as though I required their approval before proceeding with recommendations from my own physician. When my doctor suggested a particular treatment approach several years ago, I found myself preparing an elaborate explanation for my children, anticipating questions about risks, alternatives, and reasoning, well before any of them had actually asked. After my shift in perspective, I began handling these conversations quite differently. When I make decisions about my own healthcare now, I share the essential information my children genuinely need to know, particularly if it affects how they might need to support me, but I no longer feel compelled to justify every detail of my medical decisions as though I require their approval to proceed with choices about my own body. This decision remains, appropriately, mine to make in consultation with my physician, not a matter requiring extensive family debate and justification. Applying this to financial and lifestyle choices, this same principle extends to financial decisions and lifestyle choices that are entirely within my own domain to determine. When I decided, a few years ago, to spend a significant portion of my savings on a trip I had always dreamed of taking, I noticed my old instinct rising immediately, the urge to prepare careful justifications for why this expense was reasonable, why it would not jeopardize my financial security, why I deserved this experience after decades of careful saving. I resisted this instinct and simply informed my children of my plans without extensive justification. When my son expressed some mild surprise at the expense, I simply said, "I've thought it through, and this is something I want to do." I did not offer a defensive explanation of my entire financial situation to justify this single decision. This brief, confident response, I discovered, was met with far less pushback than the anxious, defensive justification I would have offered in earlier years, precisely because my calm confidence communicated that this was a settled matter rather than an invitation for further debate. Applying this to social choices and opinions, I also began applying this practice to social invitations and personal opinions, areas where I had spent decades offering elaborate justifications for choices that were entirely reasonable without any explanation at all. When I decline a social invitation now, I simply say, "I won't be able to make it this time," without constructing an elaborate excuse to justify my absence. When I hold an opinion that differs from family consensus during a discussion, I state my perspective clearly and briefly, without feeling compelled to exhaustively defend it against every counterargument offered. I discovered something important through this practice. The anxiety I once felt about offering brief, unjustified answers was almost always worse than any actual consequence that resulted from doing so. People generally accepted my brief, confident answers with far less friction than I had anticipated, and in the rare instances when someone did push back or express disappointment, I found myself far better equipped to handle this pushback calmly, precisely because I was not simultaneously managing an elaborate justification I had already invested significant emotional energy into constructing. The deeper root of why we over-explain, I want to explore honestly why so many of us develop this pattern of constant explanation, because I believe understanding the root cause helps make genuine change possible. In my own case, and in conversations with others who have recognized the same pattern in themselves, the underlying root is almost always a deep, long-standing need for approval, a belief, often formed early in life, that our choices and even our worth require validation from the people around us before they can be considered acceptable. This need for approval often develops during childhood, particularly for those of us raised in households where our decisions were frequently questioned, criticized, or required extensive justification before being accepted. This early pattern, once established, tends to follow us throughout our lives, manifesting as constant, anxious explanation of decisions that, as adults, we actually have every right to make without seeking outside approval at all. Recognizing this root cause helped me understand that my pattern of constant explanation was not really about the specific decisions I was justifying. It was about an underlying belief that my own judgment was not sufficient on its own, that I required external validation in order to feel settled and confident in my own choices. Releasing the habit of explanation required, ultimately, releasing this deeper belief as well, replacing it with genuine trust in my own judgment and my own right to make decisions about my own life without requiring approval from others. Addressing the fear that this makes you seem cold or uncommunicative, I know some of you may worry that reducing extensive explanation will make you appear cold, dismissive, or unwilling to genuinely communicate with the people you love. I want to address this concern honestly, because it is a legitimate consideration worth examining carefully. I want to be clear that this practice does not mean refusing genuine conversation or withholding information that someone genuinely needs. If my children ask thoughtful, genuine questions about a decision, I answer them honestly and completely. What I have released is not genuine communication itself, but rather the anxious, preemptive over-explanation offered from a need for approval rather than genuine desire to share relevant information. In my own experience, my relationships have not suffered from this shift. If anything, they have improved, because my communications now reflect genuine confidence and authenticity rather than anxious justification. My children have told me directly that they experience my brief, confident answers as more trustworthy than my previous pattern of extensive explanation, because extensive justification, they admitted, had sometimes made them wonder whether I was genuinely secure in my own decisions or simply anxious about their potential disapproval. What changed in how people treat me since adopting this practice consistently over the past several years? I have noticed a significant change in how people, particularly my own family, respond to my decisions and my words in general. There is less pushback, less extended debate, less questioning of decisions that are, quite reasonably, mine alone to make. I believe this happened because my calm, brief confidence communicated something my previous anxious over-explanation never could: genuine ownership of my own life and choices. I have also noticed a significant change within myself. I no longer carry the exhausting mental burden of constantly anticipating objections and preparing elaborate justifications before I have even acted on my own decisions. This has freed enormous mental and emotional energy that I once spent almost entirely on managing other people's potential reactions to my own perfectly reasonable choices. Why this matters even more after 70, I want to speak specifically about why I believe this shift matters particularly for those of us past our 60s and 70s, though I believe the principle applies at any age. As we grow older, our remaining years and our remaining energy become increasingly precious resources that deserve careful protection. The emotional labor of constant explanation and justification, sustainable perhaps in earlier decades when our energy reserves were deeper, becomes a genuine burden as we age, one that depletes resources we can no longer afford to spend so freely. Beyond the practical energy cost, I believe there is something deeply important about finally, after 7 decades of life, fully owning our own decisions without requiring outside approval to feel settled in them. We have earned, through decades of lived experience, genuine wisdom about our own lives, our own needs, and our own preferences. Continuing to seek outside validation for decisions we are fully equipped to make ourselves does a disservice to the genuine wisdom we have accumulated across a lifetime. My final words to you, my dear friends: if you have spent decades explaining and justifying your choices to the people around you, anxiously anticipating objections and preparing elaborate defenses for decisions that are entirely yours to make, I want you to know that there is another way to move through your remaining years, a way that requires far less emotional energy and produces, in my own experience, far greater respect from the people around you. You do not owe extensive explanations for decisions about your own money, your own health, your own time, or your own life choices. A brief, honest, confident statement is almost always sufficient, and in my experience, far more effective at earning genuine respect than exhaustive justification ever was. Your judgment, developed across a lifetime of genuine experience, deserves your own trust, even if it takes practice to fully believe this after decades of seeking approval from others. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will notice, in your own life, how often you offer explanations that were never actually requested, and I hope you will consider, gently but deliberately, replacing that pattern with brief, honest, confident statements instead. Your energy, your peace, and your genuine authority over your own life all deserve this simple, powerful shift. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, trust your own judgment, protect your own energy, and remember that your life has never required anyone's permission to be fully and confidently your own.